Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Jake Soderlund on South Sudan and the responsibility to prevent. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, your host and CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs. And every week I'm very happy to welcome into the studios here at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario, some guest, a noted expert on some aspect of global regional governance or international politics. And today I'm very happy to welcome Jake Soderlund.
Thank you very much.
Professor
Glad
Emeritus
to be here.
of Political Science at the University of Windsor and co-author on a major study of South Sudan, the responsibility to prevent. And in particular, you have an interest in the media coverage angle and how that relates to the management of civil conflict, at least in that part of the world. So lots to talk about, and I'm sure our audience is mostly interested in getting to the meat of the issue, but let's start first with a little background on the study that you and your colleagues have been engaged in and what you've been attempting to accomplish by means of it.
Thank you. The study basically does look at the responsibility to prevent conflict. And South Sudan, of course, is an interesting case in terms of the duration of the civil wars in that country. Excuse me, the independence of Sudan occurs in 1956. The Civil War actually began a year before independence, and the first one went on until 1972. There was an agreement that basically resulted in 11 years of relative peace. The second civil war starts in 1983 and was only ended in 2005 with what was known as the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, or CPA, that in effect set in train the referendum on whether South Sudan would be an autonomous unit within Sudan or would become an independent state. Again, given the history of warfare in Sudan, the estimates of people who perished due to the war, certainly over 2 million. So, I mean, it's a significant conflict. And it was a conflict that not only involved the armed forces of the North and the SPLM, SPLA in the South, but also involved intertribal warfare in the South. In fact, it was the tribal warfare that accounted for most of the casualties. In short, right, given that history, and looking at the responsibility to prevent, we felt that in effect the odds were probably pretty good that some kind of violence would occur, and we wanted basically to look at one, how mass media portrayed that situation, particularly first of all in terms of a responsibility to prevent, if in effect that was part of the mind baggage of media, and probably even more importantly than that, what would happen if the responsibility to prevent failed and we go to the next step, which is in effect a responsibility to react. Was there in effect any advocacy in mass media for an international response? I might just add that I've done this study with colleagues at the University of Windsor, Professor Abdel-Salam Said-Ahmed, who is currently on leave heading the UN Human Rights Office in Yemen, and fellow retiree Don Briggs, whose career has basically been in international theory. And our first effort was basically looking at Darfur, which a book was published with Lexington in 2010, and they put it out in a revised paperback in 2012. So that is the background.
And the current study will come out in the form of a book?
Hopefully, yes. We're a little, again, the fact that Abdel Salam is in Yemen and we're here has slowed things down.
Right,
academics tend not to work on deadlines at the best of times.
Isn't that the truth?
This one is kind of sliding. But certainly we have what we did. We wanted to look at media coverage of three key events. Again, media tend to focus on something that's happening. So we looked, there was a Sudan-wide election that was, again, mandated in the CPA to be held in 2009. They actually didn't get around to holding it until the spring of 2010. So we took a 2-month period around that election. The referendum, again, called for in the CPA in January of 2011 did occur right on schedule, and we did 2 months around that. The outcome of that referendum was close to 99% in favor of independence in a vote that no one has challenged as being fraudulent. Again, the numbers voting were substantial, well over the 60% threshold, et cetera. So it was pretty unanimous that independence was going to occur in a very short time. The independence was scheduled for July the 9th. And at the time of the referendum, there were a lot of issues still pending. And most of those issues, frankly, are still there. They have not been resolved.
That's an astonishing display of unanimity.
Yeah. So basically, we had hoped, as we had done with Darfur, to look at both television news coverage, and in Darfur, we looked at the three major commercial networks in the U.S. plus the New York Times. Unfortunately, the networks on both sides of the border didn't cooperate with us. In effect, there was simply not enough television coverage to do any kind of substantive analysis, other than to say that in terms of any penetration into the mass population of what was going on, there simply wasn't any. Newspapers, we took the newspaper of record in each country, which the Globe and Mail in Canada, the New York Times in the States, and the capital newspaper, the Ottawa Citizen, and the Washington Post. And for each of these events, we had a 2-month window that basically we looked at all the coverage that the newspapers.
Very good. Well, we'll get back to the details of that in a moment when we return. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So if it's all right with you, we'll, for the benefit of our audience who haven't followed the history of Sudan closely, we'll sort of step back and unpack the dynamics of the conflict that you and your colleagues were eager to help prevent if possible. So Sudan was one of these British colonies in Africa that achieved independence through decolonization, and like most of them, had no natural borders or no natural integrity as a political unit. And very quickly, a series of divides developed within the new political community of Sudan. Could you tell us a bit about those divides? How did they line up? Were they geographical, religious, ethnic, linguistic, some combination of these?
Yes. I think the way I would phrase it, Sudan occurred as an ill-advised attempt to merge a country in East Africa with a country in North Africa. And that started in the early 19th century in terms of a conquest of the Turks and the Egyptians who were running North Sudan at the time. Basically conquered the South in terms of raiding for slaves. I mean, that was the modus vivendi there. This was not a happy situation from the beginning. The British took over roughly 1888, I think the date. And they immediately over time, saw the problems of the North and the South and really initiated a policy of separation of the two, which was formalized in something called the Southern Policy. And what that did, I can't go into it in great detail, but essentially it attempted to keep the Arab influence out of the South, both in terms of language and religion, and at the same time promoted Christianity in the South through the importation of missionaries. Mm-hmm. So there was a forced divide, and that was a policy basically in place until independence. And independence, as in many areas of the world, was kind of rushed at that point in time. And what the British did was to essentially abandon the South. And the new independent Sudan comes into effect in 1956, which was basically dominated by the North. The South had held out for some kind of federal system. There was sort of a quasi-agreement that this would be considered after independence, and wasn't. In truth, the Civil War began a year before independence was declared. And in the 50 years of Sudanese independence, we're looking at 39 years of war and 11 years of peace. So I mean, this was never really a happy confluence of cultures. And
right. And to a first approximation, the population of the North was Muslim.
Oh yes, yeah. And the population of the North is primarily Muslim, as in effect is Darfur.
Right. And ethnically, how would you describe it?
Well, both are characterized by many tribes,
right.
And the relationships between these tribal groups, in many cases, have not been happy. In part, one of the strategies of warfare in particularly the Second Civil War, employed by the North, was basically to employ tribal militias to attack the South, as in fact happened with the Janjaweed militias in Darfur. That policy was not new
right.
with Darfur.
Darfur being in the north.
Yeah. The other part of the policy was basically to put tribe against tribe in the South, and that was in effect very successful. And we see problems with that today.
Mm-hmm. Now the South was actually the more resource-rich part of the country.
Certainly in terms of oil.
Yes. Of oil wealth.
Oil was discovered, I think, in the 70s. Well, certainly the commercial pumping of oil
right.
In the 70s and 80s.
And would you describe the conflict over time as primarily a resource conflict, or primarily an ethnic conflict, or primarily a religious conflict, or is there some sort of
there was a combination
mashup of these things?
A combination of all of these factors, and to give any one primacy over the whole period of the war, I think would be incorrect. The religious dimension actually did not come in until fairly late.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So even though there was conflicts within the South, sown in part by the regime in the North, you still got a 99% vote for independence.
That is true.
Which does signal a kind of unified political sensibility in the South?
Yes.
Or simply a desire to break
well, yeah, certainly a desire
to
end what they had.
Right.
Of course, there are a whole series of problems which we can, I don't know how much time we have, we can get into. But one of the things about media coverage that we wanted to look at, there are two factors of media coverage. One is volume of coverage, and that fits into what is termed in the literature agenda setting, that the mass population in effect gets its ideas of what are important issues from the issues that are covered on mass media. So if you're looking at an area like South Sudan or Darfur or the Congo, which most people do not have personal contact with, the only way you know that something is going on is basically that the media begins talking about it. And agenda setting is very much based on volume of coverage.
Right.
You know, day after day, week after week, month after month, et cetera, et cetera. The second, and this is the one that I think is probably most important in terms of the responsibility to prevent, is framing. You know, you have an event, right? There's a war. You know, 800 people are killed in a massacre or whatever. You get the facts, but how do you interpret what happened, right? What is actually going on here? And in terms, again, in terms of the international community's responsibility to prevent, does mass media in effect say, and we need to do something about it, right? I'll go back to Darfur. The rebellion in Darfur begins in 2003. Most of the January atrocities occur in the summer of 2003. Not until the spring of 2004 is the first real television coverage, television news story of Darfur.
It's quite a delay.
And this was Secretary of State Colin Powell's use of the word genocide to describe what happened.
A very controversial word at the time because it had international legal implications and required a reaction.
Yeah.
We'll be back to follow that up in just a moment. But thank you for that insight. We'll be back with Jake Soderlund in a second. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back, and sorry for the required station break there, but do want to follow up on the responsibility to prevent as a component of the concept of the responsibility to protect, which is a growing norm in international relations, the one that's sort of two steps forward, one step back. But some people don't understand that it's got different components, and probably the most important component of the R2P doctrine is the responsibility to prevent. You don't want to intervene.
That is
in
true.
the affairs of a sovereign state. If you can avoid it, so much better to try to prevent it. So most people would interpret Darfur as a test case of the early development of R2P as an operational doctrine in international politics.
Well,
a lot of people would say it's a mixed story. Right? There was a lot of rhetorical support, a certain amount of action in defense of vulnerable populations in Darfur, but at the end of the day, not a lot of effective international action, partly because African Union was tasked with it and didn't have the capacity to do much.
True.
And partly because of this debate you just mentioned over whether or not it should be called a genocide, which under international law requires intervention. And the United States was the only significant country willing to invoke that word in that context. Stepping back, in South Sudan, we didn't have that same sort of coverage that you saw in Darfur. According to your own study, there was quite a lot of coverage of the election and the referendum and the independence. Not so much in the way of coverage of conflict, as far as I can tell.
Okay. Well, the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement did end the war. And there was a period then where there was relative autonomy in the South. They had their own government, et cetera. And then the referendum was to occur in 2011 to basically decide whether the autonomous region within Sudan would continue or whether South Sudan would become an independent state. We picked up again. This was coverage in newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post in the States, and the Globe and Mail and the Ottawa Citizen in Canada. We had, again, attempted to look at television coverage, but the networks just simply didn't cover it. But in terms of the reporting in the press, Two things in terms of what the reporters on the ground, and most of the stories did come from reporters writing from the region. Certainly there was apprehension early on in April of 2010 that things would not go well. And this, of course, was the history of the conflict between North and South, and the conflict in Darfur, for instance. And the Sudanese president, Omar al-Bashir, had been indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity and later genocide for actions there. So the assumption was that, again, with a lot, 70 to 80% of Sudan's oil located in the south, that the president would not really be terribly happy if the South walked away. So the major thing that was focused on was in effect armed conflict along the border. I mean, that was anticipated. The second thing was the intertribal conflict in the South, and that was brought up. Not only intertribal conflict, but the South is a very, very poor region. It has to be in the bottom 5 in terms of poverty, lack of infrastructure, lack of experience with government. And indeed, most of the folks who are currently running South Sudan were guerrilla commanders, right? So their experience was not in democratic, not in democratic government.
But would you still call this basically a successful case of
prevention?
Yeah, you
know, that's a very good question, and one that I've come down. My position is this, that certainly I think academics expect too much. The world is tough out there, right? And what the Obama administration did, which was fairly controversial, although in the press he was never called out on it, nor was he called out on it by his political opponents. Basically, they decided that the one way that this would work is if they negotiated with al-Bashir. And what they did was to basically say, look, you behave yourself, we will take you off the state-sponsoring terrorist list, we will forgive your debt, we will do a number of nice things to you, right? And over the course of time, that appeared to be working. And even though there were these apprehensions on the part of the media, both in the fact that you couldn't trust the North to do to do the right thing, and also the problems internal to the South, the phrase not exactly quoted, but there was certainly a fear in the media that South Sudan would emerge as a failed state at birth, that basically there was simply not enough there and the problems were so significant and the abilities to deal with them so meager that the whole thing would collapse.
Did Obama proffer sticks also, or just carrots?
No sticks.
Just carrots.
The only, again, is a great book by Roberta Hamilton dealing with saving Darfur, which he then extends into the South. That basically the U.S. had used all its options short of military intervention. There was not at
never
all.
Threatened it.
Yeah. Well, the North seemed to feel threatened, but again, given Afghanistan, given Iraq, given Somalia, given a number of other things, that would have been a very difficult step to take.
Fascinating. Well, let's come back one last time to talk about the implications of that. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So let's try to explore the implications of the events and your study. What have we learned about preventing large-scale conflict? How can we promote that first part of the doctrine of R2P, the responsibility to prevent? Was the media coverage absolutely core component of this, or in your sense, was it the diplomacy, much of which was behind the scenes?
Clearly, the role of media at best is nuanced. I mean, the notion of a CNN effect that somehow public opinion, takes control of foreign policy and basically drives the government to do what it doesn't want to do. I do not, that doesn't happen. On the other hand, you look, for instance, at the work of Frank Chalk and Romeo Dallaire with the Montreal Institute of Genocide and Human Rights, talk about a will to intervene and the will to intervene. And that clearly is very flexible when you look at world problem sites, and the international community is willing, or at least gets involved in some and stays away from others. And Chalk and Dallaire point to two things. One, that media coverage, the governments are sensitive to public opinion, and that this is sort of the driving force. The other is that in the absence of media coverage, there's no pressure on governments to do anything. So there is a role in terms of the way in which media present coverage. For instance, the Darfur incidents were termed genocide. Genocide triggers a response, right? There's something there that needs to be done, right? The Congo, on the other hand, which killed huge numbers of people, far greater than Darfur, up to 5 million in the Congo and 300,000 in Darfur. The Congo was basically presented as an intractable conflict, right? Mm-hmm. That nobody could do a damn thing about it, and if you tried, you would end up with another Somalia. So in effect, it was discouraging the international community from doing anything. So yeah, the media coverage is important. In terms of South Sudan, there was very little criticism of what the Obama administration was doing. In the 2010 election, the New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof, who led the charge, by the way, on Darfur, wrote one op-ed article that basically, the election was pretty flawed, and basically criticized Obama for not taking Bashir to task in terms of a fraudulent election. Other than that, not until the North actually invaded a disputed territory, Abyei, in April of 2011. This was just a couple of months before the scheduled independence in early June. It was that military occupation, and again, it was tanks and planes and the whole 9 yards. That basically there was some counterframing that the carrots were not going to do the trick, and that essentially there had to be some what's the word I'm looking for, more robust kinds of
threat of
threats.
kinetic activity.
Well, more than threats, really. That there had to be some hard choices to be made.
Yeah, one way of interpreting the difference between South Sudan and the Congo is to say it just goes to show the importance of focusing on prevention, because in Congo there was already a conflict, so it was hard to imagine how you could stop it or slow it. In South Sudan there wasn't yet that large-scale conflict, so that provided the window of opportunity. But it's also possible, and I wonder if you would agree with this, to say the difference between Darfur and South Sudan is that in Darfur you had these international organizations trying to quarterback it, the UN and the AU.
Very much so.
And in South Sudan you had Washington basically trying to quarterback it. Is there a sad lesson here, namely that regional or global governance relies upon a proactive major power?
I think the lesson is that there are no final solutions to these. These are very complex issues. There are local dimensions, and there are regional dimensions, and sometimes there are international dimensions. And the way I've looked at both the Congo and Darfur and South Sudan is that basically the international community is most comfortable with the international regional, right? This is what conventional diplomacy does, and they've been relatively successful, The question is how much can you ask? Well, I mean, what is a good outcome, right? A perfect peace, I don't think, is going to be achieved. What is missing, and I'm sure you're familiar with a book by Séverine Althusser, The Trouble with the Congo, is that basically it is these local issues that the international community has not a clue how to deal with. And when you look at the UN force in Eastern Congo, I mean, they still have no idea what to do. Right?
It really is
intractable. And that's an entirely different skill set in terms of how to deal with those. So you on the one hand you're looking at and both conflicts have international dimensions and have local dimensions. You get one under control,
right.
the other one simply overcomes whatever good you've done. So it's a continuous process.
Well, it's nice at least to have one under control.
Yeah, that is true. But the other problem is when something happens, like the independence of South Sudan. You know, you sort of say, oh well, they've managed that one, right? We can now turn our attention to something else. But you can't do that. I mean, it involves continuous, active management, both at the international level and at the local level. I think we have a lot of folks trained at the international level, not sure what we're doing at the local level. It is, as I said, a different skill set.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights on this.
Thank you.
I certainly learned a lot, and I hope our audience will say the same. And to the audience, thank you for joining us, and join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.